Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm seeing people are still filtering in. That's pretty normal for webinars for people to kind of struggle a little bit to get connected. So I think I'd like to start as per usual, and I'm becoming somewhat famous for my presentations tend to go long. So got a lot of material that I'd like to cover and lots of things I'd like to talk about. So I'm going to try and use up as much of that time as I possibly can. Somebody already asked a question. I missed the last webinar. Is it available online? Yes, it is. Actually, I think Stephen and I discussed sending information about where you can get to the last webinar in the email that follows this one. So if you're signed up for this, we'll make sure that you get that information. Note that you do have the ability to ask questions. Please do. The presentation, I'm probably not going to pause too many times throughout the presentation to answer questions, but at the end, I'd like to review them all. So by all means, ask questions, and we can loop back around and talk about topics. In a big group like this, it's pretty hard to spend time on every single topic to the degree that people might like, but I do actually plan on doing more and more of these presentations. So please ask questions, and if I don't get to something or I don't cover a topic, feel free to ask that question. I'd also note that at the end, our plan is to put together a survey. So if you have particular areas you want focus on, let us know. I like doing these presentations. I find they're really helpful for me, and I think they're useful for people as well. So if there's areas you want to cover or you want an entire presentation on a particular topic, ask that question, and we can start to make allowances for those kinds of things. So I'll go ahead and get started, and more people seem to be piling in here, which is good. If I haven't mentioned it already, my name's Rick Dottman. I'll just jump to the next slide here. And I generally don't like spending a whole lot of time talking about who I am, but I think in this case, it's pretty topical. The presentations we're focusing on now are about people's history with Business Vision who might be interested in coming over to Spire, and why that's a good idea and what things Spire introduces. So in the last presentation, we talked a fair bit about sort of some of the specific features within Spire, but one of the criticisms, which I think was valid, was I wasn't kind of relating that directly back to Business Vision. So, how similar is Business Vision to Spire, as well as what are the key differences, and more importantly, why are they important? So I'm going to take a bit of a different tact here, and the approach I'm going to use is that we'll do a quick overview of here's the Spire process and how it looks the same as Business Vision, and then we'll go through a series of cases where we'll talk about specific functionality in Spire and why it's important. So what would this add to you if you're an existing Business Vision customer? What functionality is this providing you? Meaning what business problem is it solving? And there's quite a lot of them. I'm doing an hour-and-a-half presentation today, and I had to chop out a fair bit because there's a lot of things to talk about that are improvements over what Business Vision does. That's not surprising. This product, Spire, was developed off of a product called BV Essentials, which was essentially solutions to problems that Business Vision didn't address. And that would be everything from large module features like, production or lot numbering control or, additional functionality, but also down to some detail level questions like how to better handle back orders, how to better handle commitment of inventory. So I'm going to kind of target in on some of those specifically. My history here, I think, is relevant because I did many product knowledge seminars when I worked for Business Vision, where I was faced with questions regularly about how do I do this, or how do I do that, or I've got this business problem. Many of them I could answer very well. Some of them were kind of problems. I don't really have a great solution for you to address that. And in a lot of cases, Spire talks about those things and provides business functionality that addresses those specific concerns. So that's what we're going to talk about. The goal of the presentation, as I said, was initially to do a quick overview of comparable processes. So I'm going to add a customer, an inventory item, and a vendor. And then I'm going to take you through those processes and talk about how that process works. And then, of course, as I said, we'll finish up with business case explanations of changes or improvements. I'd love to say that this is going to be a comprehensive list of every way that Spire is enhancing your Business Vision experience. I couldn't possibly fit that into an hour-and-a-half, and Stephen will laugh when he hears this, but I tried, and it ends up being about a 4.5 to 6 hour long presentation, which I'm told I'm not allowed to do. So I've kind of tried to hit the highlights here, but certainly there'll be some things I can't cover. What do I mean about overview of comparable processes? Comparable processes are the main sort of thrust behind any MRP system or inventory system or accounting system, are some main processes and then some sort of sub-processes. So I'd call something like bank reconciliation a sub-process. It's really important, but it kind of stands on its own as a separate process. The central kind of processes are things like creating inventory items, creating vendors, creating purchase orders, taking that through that process where you're recognizing receiving inventory and right through to accounts payable, where you're then cutting checks or EFTing payments to vendors. And then similarly, your sales process, which is creating sales orders, filling inventory and managing the fulfillment of inventory, invoicing, and then managing the receivable component. So receiving checks from customers or payments from customers. So what I want to start with at the beginning of this, when I switch over to Spire, is a quick run through of add a customer, add a vendor, add an inventory item, and then do a purchase order, bring that right through the process, then do a sales order and sell the inventory item that I created through that process, and then land in a payment method scenario with the customer. So I want to do that because in the last presentation, I kind of made presented the thesis that Spire is exactly the same as Business Vision in the sense that it does the same thing and it does the process the same way, which is not entirely fair. There are quite a lot of enhancements on the Spire side, but I also think it's not fair because if you're a Business Vision customer and you first see Spire, there are things about it that are a little daunting. Many, many columns in your grid when you initially use it, many, many options that you may or may not use. So I want to kind of compare those two things just to show you that for those main processes, really important processes, things are quite similar. So let's do that. I'm just going to jump out to Spire, which I've got running over here. I haven't clicked on any modules yet, so I'm not quite at the point where I'm using anything. And let's take us through that process of adding these things. So to add a customer, all your lists basically in Spire start as lists. So you'll land in a list with all your customers, or a list with all your vendors, or a list with all your inventory items. But to add something new, you always just start by clicking new. So I'm going to add in a customer, and in this case, let's call them RN Consulting, and this is Richard Notman Consulting. And I'm just going to fill in the basics. So I live on 5 Palm Road, which is of course not true, but I'll fill in this information. So really simple to fill in the basic information. At this point, it's the same as Business Vision in the sense that there's a code you establish for a customer and its name and the basic attributes. Just like Business Vision, you can set up all the defaults. So what taxes you're going to use, what order defaults you want, what territories and salespeople you want to target that customer at. So in this respect, there's not a lot that you have to do. It's basically the same thing. And of course, if you've converted Business Vision, all this information comes across in a very mapped way as well. There's lots of things to talk about here, but we'll hit on them throughout the presentation. A big area, for example, in customer is that Spire enhances the handling of credit limit checking quite a lot. So you can do things like block a sales order at creation if a customer is past a certain number of days and terms. Or you can set credit limits that block using accounts receivable as a payment method entirely. So lots of enhancements along the way, but we'll kind of hit those in some of these business case examples. So if I save and close, that gets added to the list. And if I scroll down in the list, or if I just click in here and start typing, it'll take me right to RN Consulting, which is the new customer that I've added. We're going to talk a lot about these lists and a lot about filters, because one mistake I made when I first started working with Spire was to assume that you would always start working in an unfiltered list. And it turns out that that's probably about the worst way that you could use Spire, given that those lists, especially in areas like inventory or sales history, can be extremely large. You just never would normally work that way by default. So I'll kind of give you some ideas as to how you might use that better and how many Spire customers do. Let's add a vendor, same concept. Land in a list by default. I'm going to click new. Let's add a vendor. I'll call them DR Equipment. And this is Bench Right Equipment. Same thing here. All I really need, and I don't even really need this, but is an address. And let's see, they're in Toronto. And again, lots of additional things that we can talk about, and we will talk about in other modules. You can control things like what payment method you're going to normally use for this vendor, which is a little bit different than Business Vision. You can set up bank account information for EFT purposes. So there's a variety of things here that are additions to what Business Vision has. You can handle things like T4 statements, T4A statements, I should say, and 5018 forms. Basically, if you don't know what those are, in the construction industry, they're like T4s for vendors. So it's a recording of payments that are made to vendors that CRA requires under certain circumstances. So that's all part and parcel of Spire. But again, same concept. For a vendor, all I need to really provide is a unique vendor number and a unique name, and then I'm off to the races. I can save that vendor. And then last but not least, let's add an inventory item. Same thing, click new. This is all user level controlled. So you can block somebody from adding new inventory if you want, or modifying inventory. All the control you have in Business Vision is here, and then there's some even more discrete control. So here we're adding a bench press for our fitness company, and I'll just provide that information. The basics here are similar to Business Vision, so you can still assign things like a product category. There's some nice things that happen. You can link a product category to a sales department so that when you enter in the product category, it will automatically, if you let it, establish the sales department that gets used. You can even establish things like margins against the product category so that it'll automatically start warning you in sales orders when you're selling below your margin. So these are all nice enhancements to what is otherwise the basic process that we're going to look at. Let's keep it simple. My bench press sells for 1,000 and it costs 500, let's say. So throughout the different examples, we're going to go through looking at the price matrix and vendor pricing and how these different tabs link together purchases and sales to the customer, to the vendor, and to the inventory item. But beyond that, that's all you really have to do, and it's quite similar to the Business Vision experience. Meaning that if you've added a customer and a vendor and an inventory item to Business Vision, you can follow the same basic process here. Number of things are helpful. One thing you'll see a little bit later is that Spire actually does do some pretty neat things with integrating things like sales orders and purchase orders. So I usually recommend, if you can, or if it makes sense, to establish things like a default vendor, if you happen to have one, and even things like reorder points and minimum order quantities. Spire's pretty active about these things, meaning that if you create a purchase order, it starts looking at things like, well, what should I default the starting quantity to? It could be 1, but really it's probably best if it's at least the reorder point fill. And of course, I don't want to order any less than 5 because I know I get a break from the vendor, for example, when I buy this item at 5. So lots of neat functionality, but the basic principles are the same. So let's keep going. What I said I was going to do now, and I'm using warehousing, so do I want to copy this to the other warehouses? And I do. So my item gets added to the list, and I'll be able to find that in a list that I can sort based on whatever criterion I want to sort by. So I said we'd go through a quick run through of these processes. So let's do that. I'm going to start with purchasing. So we'll go into purchasing. And again, same concept as adding a customer, adding an inventory item, adding a vendor. I start in the list, click new, and I just start filling in the information that's appropriate for whatever it is that I'm doing. So in this particular case, let's use all the things we created. So I am buying from BR Equipment. I can start to type and then select from the list. I can fill in all the other information, order information, and reference, none of which is necessary. So I'll just go directly down to the part number. And let's say that I want to order the item that I'm going to sell, which is my DR bench. So you'll note in Business Vision, same concept. If you're in the order entry or purchasing grid, you just start typing the part number and it'll automatically complete that or give you a selected list based on that, based on the beginning of the part number, the beginning of the description. So I can still follow that same concept. I've defaulted my minimum order quantity. but I've also filled to my reorder point since I haven't yet received this. And these are all just suggestions. You can, of course, override all this. So let's keep going. In Spire, things have changed in recent versions in a good way, I think. If you want to, you can go directly to the receive, and we'll talk our way through that. But let's mirror what Business Vision would do at this case. We'll issue that purchase order. We'll preview it. And what you'll see basically is the form prints out in essentially the same way as you would see it in Business Vision. Default forms, which can be fully modified by a partner to add logos, change the header, whatever it is that you want to kind of have that form look like. One of the things that is kind of annoying in Business Vision is that it automatically closes that screen when you issue, which means you have to go load it again when you want to start into the receive process. Spire changes that and actually takes it a little bit farther than that, which I'll go into an example of. But for now, let's close that and we'll act like this is Business Vision. So 700-109 is the purchase order I'm working on. One little hint here, if you happen to know codes like that, it's much faster to type that into the search bar than it is to scroll up and down that long list. So I'll load it back up again. And the Business Vision sort of equivalent process would be that I would now go through the grid, click in the quantities for received, verify the costs, and so on. So let's do that. Let's say I want to receive 5, since that's what I ordered. I can modify the cost price if I want. And then I go to the receive process to complete that process of receiving the goods. From here, it's pretty much the same as Business Vision in the sense that I'm prompted to create a vendor invoice. If I do, I can reconcile that vendor invoice for taxes and shipping and total vendor invoice to the goods received. If that's all correct, I have the option if I want to see the journal entry, or I can just go ahead and post. That's all configurable as well. If you don't want users to be looking at the journal entry, you just want them to post, you can turn all that off. But if I post, that'll go through. I can print out a inventory receipts fulfillment report if I want. That's sometimes handy. That'll give you some justification. For example, if you've changed prices or changed quantities, you can print that out and make notes on it. But again, similar in the sense that you're following a chain of events. What should have happened if that went through correctly is that I should be able to look that part number back up again. So my BR-bench and that's 12K. Where did I put it? Did I call it a BR bench? Oh, DR bench. There you go. That's a handy little thing that I can type in part of the description. And what I should see here is that I've now got a quantity and my cost prices have been updated accordingly. And I can view receipts and previous purchase history and so on. So insofar as that's concerned, that process of adding vendors and adding customers, adding inventory items, and then the process of processing a purchase order and processing a sales order are similar. You can basically map on what you know of how you work with Business Vision onto Spire pretty easily. And it's not by accident that the default way that Spire works is very much that way, is that if you converted Business Vision information, what you would land in is an environment which is similar in the process to Business Vision. Where it starts to get interesting, certainly for me, is where the differences start to come up. So let me flip back here. And we'll just advance here. So we've added a customer, a vendor, and an item. We've created and received a purchase order, and we created and invoiced an order. And I mentioned the processes are defaulted to be very similar to Business Vision, but there's many ways to customize those processes. And that's really what I want to get into talking about is some of these business case questions about how Spire might be used. Let's go ahead and start into some of these. So adding customers, vendors, and the duplicate scenario. So I said at the beginning of the presentation that I'd had a fair bit of experience dealing with customers who are actually using Business Vision. And one of the common ones I ran into was I'm constantly running into cases where I've added customers multiple times. And the scenario is pretty common. I sell to a customer and a year later they call me back and say, I can't remember if I've purchased from you, but I'm thinking about purchasing something from you now. And the problem with it is that if you can't quickly find, based on a wide variety of criterion, that customer, it becomes very easy to just say, okay, well, I guess you're a new customer, and add you again. That follows from there into all kinds of problems where you end up with duplicate accounts receivable accounts and duplicate sales accounts, and your invoices can't be collated together for the same customer. And so it's ideal if you can find things in more elaborate ways. So let me show you an example of that. I'll come back to Spire. Let's come back to the Spire desktop. We'll go into customer, and you saw earlier on that it's pretty easy to find customers just like you could in Business Vision with codes. So if I say ABS0910, it's easy to find that customer that way. And that is obviously an easy case. So if a customer calls up and says, I don't know if I've bought anything from you before, my company name is ABSO, and your nomenclature for how you're setting up that customer number is correct, it's pretty easy to find them. What happens in the real world is companies change addresses, companies change names, companies reincorporate. So there's all kinds of ways that it can become difficult to find things. One of the things that's nice about Spire is that pretty much any aspect of that record can be searched or can be found via that find function or via the filter functions. So that means things like the middle of the address that the customer is at, or the telephone number, or cleaning, for example, as part of that, are all searchable attributes that you can find this customer by. So if you're talking to somebody and they say, yeah, I'm pretty sure that I've purchased from you in the past, but I've changed this and I've changed that, all those are searchable things. So I could, for example, say, well, what's your last name? It's Midkiff, for example. And that will find that customer record. How did it find it? It found it because that's part of the contact record. And you'll see in examples that follow, it goes much, much farther than that. So basically all aspects of this are stored in a way that's searchable via these filters. I'm kind of a technical person, and when I first started this whole thing, I couldn't figure out exactly how that worked, which for the kind of person I am drove me a bit bananas. It turns out that the way this works is via something called a full text index, which is fairly common in the web services world. It's an index that's actually collated or a table of contents that's created on the fly based on a wide variety of attributes of records. The reason I'm mentioning it here in customer is it's topical to the point, but it's all over Spire. So I can find a part number based on its part number description, any portion of its description, its UPC code, any attribute of that item that lands in the full text index is searchable, which turns out to be quite a powerful thing. You're not constrained really by just part number and description. That, of course, doesn't mean you shouldn't spend some time thinking about how to code customers, vendors, and inventory items in a consistent way. It just means that you have other options, such as in this case where you're trying to find if a customer has been added to the system. One other thing to note while I'm on this topic, let's just clear this off, is that if you go to these modules, you're also able to change codes. So that basically means that if this customer calls up, you find them, but you find out that they're no longer called ABSO's Clean Industries, they're called something else entirely, and your customer code nomenclature no longer makes sense, you're not stuck with it forever, which in Business Vision you kind of are. You can change that customer code to something else. And that's all based on the idea that Spire points to unique identifiers for records as opposed to the actual customer number being the key. And that applies to vendors, that applies to inventory items, and obviously to customers. So you can change all those things. Be careful changing. It does change globally, meaning that it will change right back into sales history. So you really are taking that customer number and changing it throughout the system all in one fell swoop. Sometimes that's the right solution, sometimes that's not the right solution. So use that with some discretion. And of course, you can block users out of being able to use these code change facilities if you want to. And you can even import into this if you've got a list that you've been building up over time. Okay, let's keep going. Another business case. This one I can't show easily, and I was actually even contemplating not talking about it, but I think it's an important one. One of the big differences between Spire and Business Vision is the notion of drop transactions. Basically, it illustrates itself where it comes up as I run my balance sheet or my income statement, or I look at my trial balance, and I recognize that the value that's in that chart of accounts doesn't equal the value of the transactions on a period by period basis. Often that kind of problem comes up at a year end when you're trying to kind of reconcile exactly what happened. And then the other way that it expresses itself is I'm sitting in accounts receivable and I don't see an invoice, but I have a customer check in my hand, which matches or should match an invoice that I should see in accounts receivable. So why does that happen, and what's different with Spire? Why it happens is that Business Vision goes through a process of affecting modules sequentially. So when you post an invoice, it updates inventory, updates the customer, updates accounts receivable, updates sales history, and so on and so on and so on. If you have a power failure during that process, or something goes wrong that interrupts that process, you can end up with what's effectively a partially posted or dropped transaction. Spire approaches this differently, based largely on the database engine that we have access to, and it uses what's called a transaction. The transaction works like this. You start the transaction, you begin to update all the relevant modules that you're going to update, or database tables that you're going to update, and only when you say this process is complete, release this transaction, does the entire process complete. So what that means is that you either get a complete transaction or you get no transaction. And no transaction is a good thing in that context, because it essentially means you're left with the sales order you started with, or you're left with the purchase order that you started with, and you can go back and start to process that. It's a bit of a combination of the database engine that we're using, as well as the fact that Spire is a true client-server application. So the server will reject in a transaction which can't be completed, which hasn't been essentially released to the database. So I would say that that was a fairly common question, except that the question generally didn't come up in product knowledge seminars so much as from customers who were dealing with this kind of thing. And it can sadly be a bit of a needle in a haystack type of problem to try and find. So you won't find that kind of problem in Spire, which I think is an important thing, important differentiation between Business Vision and Spire. Need to be able to search. So since we're started talking about that, let's keep on it. The case is I need to be able to find things based on information other than code and the start of the description. So we've already started to see an example of this. There are common types of searches, and I don't want to have to type them over and over again. So that's kind of just getting into an elaboration of searches, not only how they work, but some of the things that you can do with them. So let's flip back to Spire. And let's show you a couple of examples of this. So we saw that when we were searching for customer, I can search for sort of any element within a record within the customer list, for example, or the vendor list. And obviously I can do the same thing in inventory. And you saw me do this when I made that mistake earlier, by just saying, okay, I'm interested in a bench press of some kind. So if I just type bench, then I'm going to get a list of just those things that are benches. The powerful thing that's different than Business Vision is it's any portion of the description or any element that relates to the inventory record. So I could even take that further and say, well, it's not just that. I also want a Precor bench. Precor bench. And there are my Precor benches. So in a large inventory file, you can kind of use the way that you constructed your description to sort of subset the searches that you're after. Where this becomes powerful, though, is when it comes back to how you might subdivide your inventory records or your sales order records or your customer records based on stored filters. So I'll kind of turn this around and put it a different way. Almost no customers who've used Spire for any length of time work directly out of the lists themselves, because it's a bit crazy to work out of an inventory list with 200,000 records in it when you would normally have subsetted that in some way that's meaningful to you. So what does that mean, subset it in some way that's meaningful to you? It means that you would probably do something like this. You'd set up a filter and you'd say, I'm interested in setting up a list where I see where the product code is one of, and then we use whatever the product codes are that you've established. So here, I have a product code list of just those things that are weights. And that might be enough. I might want to have that as one of the lists that I work from. But you can, of course, keep going. So here I can say, and within that list, I'm interested in only those cases where the on-hand quantity, I'm just hitting O to jump there, is greater than 0, for example. So I can have sub-lists that I work out of, and those can be unique to users, or they can be available to the entire company. So if I'm the person who's responsible for purchasing, I might have lists that are dividing up my inventory based on primary vendor. But if I'm in the sales arena, I might be focusing specifically on those items that are related to weights, for example, if I'm selling to gyms. And then, of course, this wouldn't be super useful if you couldn't save it. So I can save that preset and call it weights, for example. And I can say whether it's just mine or it's a company list thing. And I can also say whether it's shown in this list over here and whether I want to save the column state, which means I can rearrange the size of columns and hide and show columns and so on. So if I do that, what happens is I now have kind of a subgrouping of inventory over here. I don't want to give the impression that you can't change this one. You can actually change the default to only show, for example, items with quantities or whatever you want. Well, oftentimes what I see is people leave the default and then they'll go ahead and add in those things that are topical to them. One question I've had in the past is, well, if that's so useful, why doesn't Spire do that for you? And the answer is because we don't know how you might divide things. We don't know what product categories you use and how they're meaningful to you. We don't know what vendors are important and which ones you can leave as separate groups. So we kind of leave it to the people using the software to decide how they're going to divide these things up. But really easy to move between them. Just click on it and it'll automatically refresh the list. It does hold on to things like sorting. So if I sort the list based on description and save it that way, or I move, what would be a good example? The on-hand quantity is really important and I want to see that first thing. That automatically can be saved as part of that stored filter, if you like. And the neat thing about stored filters is they go with your database. So they're backed up and restored as part of your database. So if you move to a different server, they all come with the database as well. All of this applies on the other side in terms of searching and filtering in sales orders. So let's show you that. Where I'd say arguably it's the most important. So let's go in and do a new sales order. We'll use my favorite customer. And what happens here is all those filters that I mentioned apply. So if I type bench, I start to see the bench or the benches that I'm selling. And if I type Precor, I start to see the subset of those. So again, you're not limited to the start of the part number and you're not limited to the start of the description. You can essentially type in whatever you want. The neat thing here is you can go even further with that because that will even allow things like UPC codes to be searched. So you can even alias part numbers by saying, I'm going to throw UPC code in there that says a different part number that refers back to the part number that I would normally use for something because vendors refer to it in a different way or something like that. So it's quite powerful, very, very fast, even in large databases. And I can keep working through this. If I want to look for anything that contained weight, for example, I can do the same thing. So there's a list of my weights that I can scroll through and add things from. And then, of course, selecting it's easy, just tab across, pick whatever it is that I want, press enter, and I'm on to the next line. If I had to say the one most commonly requested thing in my days of doing product knowledge seminars, it was probably right here. The idea that I need a quick way to be able to look things up and the part number is not always sufficient and the description is not always sufficient for me to be able to find the thing that I'm looking for. I need a Google-like search, essentially, when I'm going through trying to add inventory items to purchase orders or sales. And effectively, with the full text index, that's what's achieved in Spire. We'll come back and loop around to this and talk a little bit about this when we talk a little bit about UPC codes a little later as well. Let's jump out of here. One thing I was showing somebody the other day that I thought people were aware of, but I found really useful is this. You can actually make changes, group changes to items by selecting them and editing them, and we're going to show you an example of that in a second. But one useful thing is when you're dealing with filtered lists, let's say I want to review all these items and I want to change prices because the competition has put their prices up and I want to do the same. So I don't have a rule. I just want to kind of review this list and look at the prices. So one way to do it is you double click on the item, go to the prices tab. Oh, I want that price to be higher, save and close, and go to the next one and double click on it. But a better way to do this that takes advantage of the filters is when you come into an inventory item, that's what these arrows are for, meaning that I can navigate in sequence as to how the items are listed in that grid. So now I can work through the parts one by one. Oh, that price should be 35 because I want to make a 40-point margin. Next, save. I'm already making 40 points, but I think I can do better. Next, save. And you'll notice what's happening is you're navigating along through the list that's presented over here. That price is good. Next one, oh, I know I can do better here. And then next, and save. So you're really kind of first filtering to get the subset of items that you want, and then using the navigation so that you're specifically on those items that you want to edit, and you don't have to go in and out and in and out and in and out like you have to do in a lot of cases within Business Vision. So super useful to be able to use these filters, and it's fair to say that in every example I've seen, they're highly used. Okay, let's save that. We'll come out of here. So the case was I need to be able to search. So we've talked about the search box. We've talked about filters and stored filters. They're highly used. We talked a little bit about autocomplete and filtering, which you saw an example of, and you're going to see a few more. I haven't shown you yet the example of using the full text index or the FTI and non-visible fields, but in an example a little bit later, I'm going to show that to you when we look a little bit at UPC codes. So essentially, there's tons of different ways that you can find an inventory item in any context, in the inventory module, in purchasing and sales, wherever it is that you're looking for the item. So let's go on to another case. Again, common thing I noticed, especially when I was visiting customers, my order list is difficult to work with. So my order list is busy, has many records, and I want to clean it up. Quotes are good for a period of time, but customers often make buy decisions later on down the road. And I'm never sure of all the quotes that I have, which ones are active and which ones aren't. So let's come back to Spire. And a couple things to talk about here. As I already said, it's a good idea to filter these lists right out of the gate. There's no real good reason in Spire to land in an order list that is every order that you have that's currently active. What I generally see at minimum is people establishing a filter for open orders, booking orders, and quotes, for example, as separate sort of sections of the order file. It's a bit daunting to deal with an order file that has 1,200 orders in it, and oftentimes it's not necessary. So one part of this answer is, set up filters that group out your orders in meaningful ways. Another answer is you can actually at any point delete orders, and you can do it in a group fashion. So I can slide and select, or I can use the control key and select, or I can hold down the shift key and select ranges of orders. And then if I have the authority to do so, I can click the delete option and delete ranges of orders. So here I might say, well, I'm deleting these orders. Let's call these out of date, for example. And then they're removed from the order file. One of the things that we've started to do in Spire, and you're going to see it happening more and more in other areas, is we don't like to delete things permanently for a lot of good business reasons. So one option that's in more recent versions of Spire is I can go to recover deleted sales orders. And what that does is gives me a complete list of sales orders that have been deleted in the past. And off on the right, there's delete reasons that you can see as well. So to recover a deleted sales order, I just select it, click on edit. And when I go through this process, I can basically just click on recover. And that takes it out of the deleted order list and re-adds it back into the main order list. It's actually a bit more complicated than that, because essentially what it's doing is reestablishing all the attributes of that order back in the order file. So it's reestablishing things like back order quantities and ship committed quantities based on the current state of available inventory. So it's actually not just saying, okay, put it back. It's actually going through the process of treating that like it was a brand new order that was entered back into the system. Why is this relevant? The main reason I've found when I've talked to customers in the past for why they don't want to delete orders is it's a pain to create them. So it might take you, a couple of hours to go through adding in 150 part numbers, negotiating prices, doing all the things necessary to get that sales order in. And even if it's 6 months old, the last thing you want to do is delete it on the 6th month and 1 day and have the customer call you a week later and say, okay, I've made up my mind. I want to go forward. The nice thing about recover deleted is you don't have to worry about that so much anymore. All you have to do essentially is go back into recover deleted or ask somebody who has the authority to do that to do so, and they can bring that order back. Our plan going forward is to actually start doing that with a lot of different things, so that you're never in a position where you're afraid to remove something from the list for fear of not being able to kind of bring it back again. And there's some technology enhancements that allow us to do that. Let's jump back. I need to be able to edit and tag records. I often need to make sweeping changes to records, and I also need to tag or identify aspects of business information that is neither code nor description or name. This is sort of another way of saying I want to be able to find things more easily, but I also want to be able to edit things more easily. So a couple of things worth mentioning here. Let's jump back. One of them, and inventory might be a good place to show this. Actually, maybe weights is a good place to show this since I've added that grouping, is if you select a variety of items, and you don't have to have them contiguous, and you click edit, you can make changes to items in groups. So if I had one item selected or I double clicked on an item, I'd load the maintenance up for that one inventory item. Here, when I click edit, because I had multiple selected items, I can change attributes of those items. It's unlikely you'd change something like description here, but you might reassign product codes en masse. You might establish alternate part numbers en masse. That's probably less likely. You might change their methodology for serialization. Here, I'm just going to do something simple and say, those items are particularly important to me, so I want the sales department to know about them. When I do that, that automatically changes the color of those items, and that will show up now in purchasing and sales orders. In the last seminar, I talked a little bit about color, and somebody asked the obvious question, which is, what does color mean? And the answer is, when you assign it like that, the color means whatever you want it to mean. But oftentimes customers will use that for something that's meaningful in their own business. These are customers that you need to be concerned about terms with. These are inventory items that I want you to try and move through the system because we can't get them anymore, or we've got too much inventory value invested in them. It's whatever you want it to mean. So you can apply those color changes in whatever way makes sense. A couple quick things to mention. Let's go back to customer for another example. We talked about searching and finding things and tagging records. I should probably mention, it doesn't really matter who I load to show this, that with current versions of Spire, the user-defined field section is now part and parcel of the package. It used to be an add-on. Now, when you purchase a license for Spire, you automatically have access to UDFs or user-defined fields. Super useful. What's a user-defined field? Effectively, they're fields that you can add on your own. So Spire didn't ship with a notes field specific to a particular address, for example, or last contact dates. I've kind of built my own little contact manager in here by adding in these fields. The neat thing here is that I can put whatever I want in them, just like I can for communication. So here I might say this was referenced, my refer was point blank Jim, let's say. And while I'm at it, let's add a communication. And let's say that referred by Sue Smith. She's a great reference. So you can do tons of different things with communications and UDFs, and I'm just giving you a quick example. The key thing is that when you've provided that information, that also becomes searchable. So if I say I'm looking for Sue Smith, that pops up. So not only are any of the fields that are in the module searchable, but anything you put in the UDF fields becomes part of the full text index, and anything you put in a communication becomes part of that. So that was entered into a memo field in the UDF, but similarly, Point Blank Jim should bring that up as well. So all of these things are searchable, and you can use them to tag records for all kinds of different purposes. That's not how I'd normally, if refer was important, I'd probably set up a UDF field specifically for that purpose, and I'd call it refer so that I can really properly report on that. But for ad hoc type of information that you need to be able to get back to for some reason, it's really, really useful. And as we saw, you can use that in any level of the filter. So I can save my own filter. I can use that as a search. Whatever it is that I want to use that for, I can use it for. And then, of course, if I delete that, it'll show me the entire customer list, or whatever category of customer list I happen to be on. Let's keep going. This is a big one. Somebody else mentioned in the last presentation that I didn't talk about this, and it's a really important part about Spire. So the business case is my business relies on cash flow, and I need to keep a close eye on receivables and facilitate dunning and collections. Saying a business relies on cash flow is a little bit like saying that briefly after I inhale, I exhale. Every business requires that if they're having tracking receivables and payables, that they're keeping an eye on cash flow. It's kind of a basic business requirement that your line of credit is the catch-all between the difference between those things. So every business, including even some of the stuff that I've done on my own, requires you chase receivables. So let's, rather than going through those points, let's show you. I'm just going to jump back to Spire. So you saw when I was looking at customers, if I load a customer, that you can actually process receivables directly within a customer. So I can add items and make payments and so on directly within a customer. And I would say that when you're looking at it in that way, specific customer and then their open items and invoices and payments, that's a little bit like the way that Business Vision handles it. You load the customer and then you deal with their receivables. The downside to that is the only way that you can handle that is by printing out reports. I'll print out aging reports, figure out which customers I need to be chasing, then chase them, print out statements and send them to them and so on. So I would say it's not the most ideal way for you to be dealing with receivables. Spire approaches it a bit differently. There's an actual module for accounts receivable, but that starts with a list. This is probably not the best example because everybody in this company is at 120 days. Something's clearly went wildly wrong here, but the idea is that I can sort by any of these columns and I can quickly at a glance kind of see where I'm at receivables wise. Who's over 30 days, who's over 60, who's over 120 days. What's even useful beyond this is that filters work here also. So I can say, well, let's do a filter where I want to know anybody who's got a balance that's greater than 0 at 120 days, which in this case is everybody. But let's take this a little further and say I also want to know when their last payment amount is 0, let's say. So if you spent any time in business, especially in some of the larger businesses, you know that if somebody's at 120 days and they have yet to pay any of their invoices, that's trouble. You really want to chase that because if they haven't paid you anything at this point, then that's not even really showing good faith in terms of how things work. So very easy to manage this right from this screen. What's even nicer is that throughout Spire, you can quickly select things and produce documents. So I could, for example, say, okay, I've got cash flow problems. I really need to chase all these people. So I'm going to choose to print selected, and I'm going to produce a customer statement, and I'm going to email it. What happens here is you select which contact type you're going to use. That creates a complete list of all the customer emails that for all the customers in that list, and I can select the template. These templates you can create and maintain within Spire. So this is a template that I could even modify here if I wanted to. That's the strong warning one. Please pay me. I haven't received a payment yet, that kind of thing. From that point, it's pretty straightforward. You just click send, and that will automatically produce statements for all the customers in that selection, emailing the main contact on each one of them. Rather than do that for everybody, since I'm not sure who that's going to, I want to show you an example of this though. So let's get rid of that, and let's go back to, get rid of that, and let's go back to the main customer that I want to work with, who I actually put my email address on, and we'll actually send the email. So we'll go print selected. I want to send a customer statement. I want to send it via email. I want to go to the main contact, which happens to be me, and I want to use the template, the strong warning template. So what happens is when I click send, it goes through, generates the statement, attaches it to the email, and then processes it right through. And what I'll see now if I look in my sent box or my inbox is it sends out that email. Let me just see if I can find that in my email, and I'll show you what that looks like on the other end as well. And one time I'm asked to sign in is right now, so give me 2 seconds and I will sign in and show that to you. So there it is. So it looks like this in Gmail. So there's who I sent it to, the text of the template that I set up, and you can have an unlimited number of templates set up in Spire, and then there's the statement attached. So it's really handy if you're dunning, if you're collecting, because you can go into that list, sort it in whichever way you want, know exactly where you stand without having to print out reports, and then select amongst a group of customers or specific customers you want to talk to, and send them a list of all that. It's just as easy to do the same thing through sales analysis. One of the tactics, the old business tactics with this is, you contact the customer and the customer says, I need to see the details of the invoice, hoping that'll push you off and make you wait a little while. You can just as easily go into sales history, select those invoices, and email those to the recipient as well. So very, very straightforward. The person who pointed this out to me kind of said that for them, that was probably the biggest advantage that they experienced with Spire was I can improve cash flow because I can quickly get to who owes me what without having to do a whole lot of hoops jumping. So that's a quick example. It's also equally easy to manage payments in batch. I won't go through an example here. I think I did one in the previous presentation of that one as well. Okay, let's come back to PowerPoint. And let's take a quick look at this idea. So I want to better manage suggestive sales. Many of my customers are repeat customers, and I want to make sure they are served well, and I want to drive sales from the knowledge of their previous and current purchases. I'd say if you were looking at sort of the beginning of BV Essentials, which was the precursor of Spire, that this was probably where it started in terms of leaping into providing functionality. And it was the idea that instead of just the sales process being an order entry function where you want to just be able to pound in orders as quickly as you possibly can, that providing some facility in that module was important, specifically for the purposes of having the kind of conversation with a customer that can further sales and provide better support and service. So what does that all mean? Let's jump back into Spire. Let's go into sales. I'll pick a customer who I know has got a bit of activity. So I'll start a new sale, and I think a good example is probably Acor 673, which again, I could have typed in any aspect of that to find them. And let's do a quick sale. Here I'm going to sell them an SPS 500 FM. Oops, SPS, I should be paying attention. SP 500, that's why I said FM. And I'm going to sell them an SPPG, that's correct. And I'm going to sell them an INSK B15. So really simple and straightforward to type things in. I don't have to navigate through all those columns. I can hide them if I don't want to. If I don't have access to sync costs, I won't even see margin columns, but really straightforward. But where the process comes into the how do I handle suggestive sales better is while I'm in this process or while I'm going through this, I have full access to things like whether they have current sales orders. I know they do because the tab is turned red. So I can say, oh, I see you've got current sales orders. But even further than that, I can go into the details of those sales orders and see, okay, you've got orders outstanding for some weight belts, and you've got some jump ropes on order, and so on. So I can have a conversation with that customer about their existing open orders. That could be as simple as, I want to make sure you don't double up. Or it could be as much as, okay, you know, I see we've been working on this back order for a while, and we really need to get it to you. And then even further than that, you can go into sales history. And in sales history, you can have conversations about, okay, I see you've got invoices in the past, but more importantly, the items that you've purchased in the past are these. And you can see exactly which ones you're looking at. I've got order items only clicked. That basically means I'm seeing the same items that I've currently ordered in terms of previous invoices. That's super useful because I can say, oh, I can see in the past you've ordered 19 of these kettlebells when you ordered them, and you're only ordering 2 this time. Is there something I can do to help with that? You know, better the price, or, you know, offer some other form of service. And then of course, if I uncheck that, I can see everything at the part number level that they've bought in the past. So how many they've bought, what price they've bought, and that's all sortable as well based on part number or invoice number or whatever it is that you want to sort based on. So again, it really helps with the conversation because at this point now, I have full access right at my fingertips to all the different elements of things that they might have bought in the past. And I don't have to go digging around and looking at invoices and loading them and so on. A little step better than that, if you're having that conversation and you decide you want to add some items, you can just select them from the list and choose add to order. And if you look at the bottom right hand corner, when I click add to order, what happens is that the value goes up, and the reason is because it's adding those items to the order based on that selection. So really powerful idea, because what that essentially lets you appear as to the customer is that you're very knowledgeable about their account, as well as being very knowledgeable about, you know, what they might have paid for an item in the past. So it really facilitates great sort of suggestive selling and directing people in the right way. One thing I didn't know until recently is that Spire also checks for duplicate PO numbers within a given account. One of the things I used to recommend to the clients I work with was, when you're creating sales orders, make sure you record the customer's purchase order number. So in Business Vision, that was useful because you could quote that back to them. Spire goes a little step further than that. If you type in a duplicate purchase order number within a customer when you're creating a sales order, it will warn you that you may be creating a duplicate sales order. You might think that's not a big deal, that never happens. In some customers, it happens with some regularity. You have 2 people managing purchasing, they both phone in the same PO, 2 sales orders get created, and it just creates a bit of a nightmare where customers are shipping product back and nobody's particularly happy about that because somebody's paying freight in 2 directions. So nice little things like that in Spire that are minor enhancements to the way that Business Vision functions, but can be of great value. So let's keep going. I'll just close that, and we'll come back to PowerPoint. This is an important one, I think. So suggestive selling, we talked about sales from customers, sales history at the item level for sales. I didn't get into it. I think I talked about it in the last presentation, but you can copy sales orders directly from sales invoices and sales history. So one useful thing here is that customer calls you up and says, you know what, I want exactly what I got last time. All you have to do is look up the invoice and sales history, click the copy button, and it will automatically create a brand new order based on exactly what they bought last time. And oftentimes, especially if they're big orders, even if they're not buying exactly what they bought last time, it's useful to start with it. So, you know, here's the 100-line sales order that was from an invoice I copied, and I'll delete off the lines that I don't want and add on the lines that I do. So lots of things in Spire to kind of help you avoid having to retype information. Okay, next point. I deal with limited inventory. Okay. Big difference here, I think, that's a subtle one between Business Vision and Spire. Customers often order in advance, and I have to juggle limited quantity and high demand items high demand for specific items. The way that Business Vision works is that it always tries to better an order. Bettering means it tries to automatically apply ship commitment every time you load the order. There's the option to turn that off, but almost no one ever does that because turning it off turns it off completely, meaning that you now have to kind of manage your own shipping manually, which is not ideal either. So what happens and I have a particular customer I pass to is in this situation a lot, you end up with inventory being sloshed around a lot because you have limited commitment, and every time you look at an order, it commits the inventory. So it's like having water in a fish tank sloshing from one side to the next. It's a lot of trouble to kind of try and keep track of it. So Spire approaches this a bit differently. And if you're a Business Vision customer who's not worked with Spire, I think you'll find some value in this. Let's demonstrate that. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to start by adding a new inventory item. And let's call this something simple, DR57. So this is a bench press with leg attachment. And we'll keep the numbers nice and simple. Sells for 1,000, its cost price is 500. And we want it in all the warehouses. We'll do a new sale. And this new sale will be for a customer I'm going to use over and over again, A309, for a DR57. So I got insufficient quantities, which is no surprise because it's a brand new inventory item. So perhaps I haven't ordered this item yet, for example. So let's go ahead and save that. The order number that I'm dealing with here is 800-122, and we'll save and close that. Let's go do a quick purchase. I want to talk about something here too. Let's buy from Inspire. And I'm going to buy a DR57. And I didn't set up a minimum quantity, but let's say I'm going to order 5, let's say. So there's my limited quantity. Quick note here, recent change in Spire. I mentioned earlier on that you can speed up the purchase order process tremendously. Let's say in this example, I already know that I have these items. Somebody's went out, purchased them. I've already got the vendor invoice. I'm comfortable with the cost and the selling prices when I created this purchase order. One neat thing in Spire is if I'm allowed to, based on my user settings, I can go directly to receive. So no more of this issue, close the purchase order, reload the purchase order, find the item, put in the quantity. You can simply just go directly to receive. What that does essentially is just does all those steps for you. It assumes you meant you're receiving everything and that you've already confirmed the cost prices. Really useful if you're buying shop supplies and that type of thing on a purchase order. So that's not the point of this conversation. I just wanted to quickly show you that. The point of the conversation is when I load that sales order back up again, so I said that was 800-122, and I pick it, rather than taking the Business Vision approach, which is let's just go ahead and commit inventory automatically, you get a prompt at the top saying there's now available inventory for you to commit. And you can control that right down to the line level. So I could just say, and in this case, I think I will just say ship available, and that will go through the order and better it, meaning it'll now act like Business Vision would have automatically. Why does that matter? It matters because in certain circumstances, you don't want the system to be just firing out committed quantities whenever you look sideways at an order. You actually want to specifically allocate those committed quantities, and that can be based off of all kinds of things that are hard to systematize. You know, is this my best customer? Is this a large sales order? Is this the one item that completes a large sales order? These are all criterion that people who are managing limited inventory have to cope with, and the way Business Vision handles that is very difficult to manage. If you look at the sales order, you have to go back in and say, I don't really want to commit this inventory. So you have a lot more control. And then, as I said, right at the line level, you can say fill all back orders or on selected items. So you can select specific items you want to fill back orders on. So a lot more control and a lot more prompting you through this process, which I think makes a whole lot more sense. There's another element to this question. And the other element to this question, which is, again, a difference between Business Vision and Spire. When you're creating sales orders, by default, the sales order type that you're creating, if you haven't modified anything, is what's referred to as an open sales order. But you have other options here. You can do quotes, which are similar to Business Vision, work orders, which are a little bit different. But one really useful order type is a booking order. So if I put in a booking order and I think it was a DR57. Booking orders, you'll notice, don't automatically ship or back order. The idea is that you would use a booking order for the purposes of future orders, for example. So who might this apply to? Let's say you're in a business that's seasonal and you need to do inventory planning. You've got a bunch of orders in advance from customers saying, come this summer, I know I'm going to need X number of these pool supplies or Y number of these bathing suits, for example. I don't want to ship commit anything at this point because all I'm really doing is building up an order list. So that's one of the useful things about a booking order, is that it doesn't sort of try and play with back orders or shipping, because you know that you're not going to be invoicing this order right away. You can even do things like set required dates somewhere in the future so that you can do some forward planning about materials requirements. What am I going to need to fulfill all these orders? So there's a number of different order types, I guess I'd say, Inspire that have useful attributes. And this is an example of one that I don't think really has an equivalent on the Business Vision side. If I save that, let's go ahead and save and close. At any point in the future, I can come back again and either commit that directly if I want to, or I can dismiss that and say, well, let's just turn that now into an open sales order. And it will automatically commit according to whatever it is that I'm doing. So again, lots of additions to the functionality that Business Vision has available, and they're all there for specific purposes. Okay, let's come back. Limited inventory we talked about, so booking orders. Standing orders I didn't talk about, but slightly more powerful standing order capabilities here, because you can establish something of a calendar of the application of an order. Quotes is similar to Business Vision, but the big points I wanted to get across were the prompts for commitment instead of it being automatic, and your ability to control the filling of inventory in a more specific way. And for certain types of customers, that's quite important. Okay, storing negotiated prices. What does that mean? So in the Business Vision parlance, negotiated prices could be referred to as customer-specific pricing, or CSP as it's referred to in the Business Vision terms. For certain customers or certain users of Business Vision and Inspire, that's a big part of their business, is that all prices or many prices are negotiated. So the problem with that kind of environment is that you end up in a bit of a maintenance nightmare, because you don't have 20 sell price levels times the number of inventory items you are. You have sell price levels times customers times inventory. So maintaining and even creating that kind of relationship can be difficult. One of the things that Spire does is facilitates for this by the way it allows you to handle pricing within sales orders. So let me show you a quick example of that. I'm going to come back to Spire. Let's close that. And let's talk about the negotiated sales order idea. To do this one, I'll do a new sale. I want to see the whole list now, so we'll get rid of that. And I'll do a new sale. And let's do it for my favorite customer. And let's add the item INSKB15. So the price is normally $35, and that's my standard sell price list for that item. But this is a great customer, and as a user, I've got this authority. So I'm going to say I'm going to have a negotiated price of $29. So the great customer, I'm willing to deal with a 30% margin instead of a 40% margin, let's say, because this is a great customer. In Business Vision, I'd then have to go maintain that price. I'd have to say, okay, I want to set up a customer specific price. Here, I can say, no, I'm going to go ahead and say I want to store that selected price. So, and I'm going to just say that I'm going to take the defaults here. So what that does is establishes that now as a customer specific price. So when that customer, A309, buys that item, INSKB15, they're now going to get the price that I've established in sales orders. So you're really giving your sales order person a fair bit of latitude, and that might be the owner himself or herself, but you're giving them a fair bit of latitude about establishing a pricing relationship going forward. If I go on to another sales order, let's just show that worked. I'll go back in, create another sales order for my A309, for my INSKB15, what did I say it was, 15. What I should see now is that I've got the customer specific price, or negotiated price in this case. You can always click in a price and get a drop down list of all the available prices. I notice people often forget that. So although I'm getting the price of $29, other prices, meaning the regular price, can also be listed. And that's useful if you're trying to figure out, based on looking at that list, okay, is this price in range of anything rational in terms of the 20 selling prices that I have? Where's that all stored? Let me show you. If you go into the inventory price matrix, and you can get at this list from customer, from vendor, from inventory, it's kind of accessible from all those different modules. You can access that price directly. Probably the easiest way to do that is to find the customer, and there it is, A309. There's the item. If I double click that, I can see exactly what got created. So for this warehouse, for this item, for this customer, I have a negotiated price of $29. So you can maintain this here, and there's tools for importing into this list, and you can export this list. There's a bunch of different things you can do with it. I won't go into a lot of detail here. I talked a bit in a previous presentation about this. The best way I can put this is that all the facility that you had in Business Vision for maintaining pricing scenarios is supported within this module, plus a whole lot more. So it's basically everything you had plus some significant percentage of more functionality. I'd also, though, say that it's also an area where you can get into a fair bit of trouble if you're not careful, meaning that if you provide the facility to have unique pricing, you have to maintain it going forward as costs go up. There are things in here that people have asked for, certainly of me over the years. A big one is the ability to establish a price based on margin. So I can override that price that was stored and say, in the future, I want that price to be automatically based on the margin that is based on cost price. If I do that, and I save and close that, let's create another sale. And same customer, same item, so A309 and INSK B15. What I'll see now is the price has now changed. So now the price is variable based on the margin. So cost price relative to selling price. I'm not sure that as a pricing recommendation, that's a great idea, though I've had enough requests for it over the years that I gather that people want it as sort of a starting point. You know, I want the initial price I see when I'm creating an order for a customer to be based off the cost price using the margin that's associated with the product category of that inventory item. And I can see it being useful in that way. Essentially being kind of in this case for this customer, they're got the friends and family discount, and they're always going to get a selling price, which is based off the fluctuations in my cost price. So short version, very powerful price matrix that supports a lot of different rules for pricing, and that's 20 selling price levels plus product discounts plus quantity breaks and so on and so on. But be careful how you use it. The more complex you make your pricing regime, the harder it is to maintain that going forward. Okay, let's jump back. So we've stored our prices. That's stored in the price matrix, just like a lot of other types of prices. Margins can be established at the product group level. You can set up warnings. I think I showed that in a little bit more detail in the previous presentation. And you can set up vendor pricing there as well that supports your purchase order processing. Back orders. This is a big difference, again, between Business Vision and Inspire. So in Business Vision, when you create a sales order and then you process that, and there are back orders left over, the sales order number is maintained, and essentially the sales order is revisited when you've got available inventory for you to process. The problem with that approach is that it can be very difficult to kind of keep an eye on a large list of orders when you're not sure which ones have back orders and when they've been processed and so on. So one difference in processing that I generally recommend, just close this before I do that, is an option that you have in company settings. And there's quite a few options in company settings, but I'll kind of highlight this one. So in company settings, let's go to sales orders. There it is. And invoice processing. You can use something called a suffix when processing orders, and you can create back orders when invoicing. So what does that mean? Let me show you an example of that. So let's pick an order. We'll just pick one off the list. What's one that's got a good example of a back order? 94 is a good one, I think. So a couple things right off the top. First off, I know that it's back ordered because there's a checkbox there, and I can see that it's back ordered when I load the order. At this point, I can force commitment if I want to, if there's available inventory, or if I'm allowed to force into a negative inventory, which Spire does allow you to do if you provide that facility. So let's do that. I'm going to say I'm going to ship 6, and let's go ahead and invoice. And let's go to on account. There's a whole process for tracking credit. I'm allowed as a user to override credit, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. And there's my invoice. I'll just cancel the printing of that invoice. So now basically I've got an order. The difference is that because I've said I want backorder suffixing, I now have the ability to see right in the list with that highlighted order that I'm on my first sort of iteration of that order. So it's not -0 anymore, it's -1, and that will continue to go up. If the customer says, you know what, you shipped me 6 last time, I think I really desperately need 3 more, and I go ahead and invoice that, that number just keeps going up. Let's go to on account. We'll override the credit. We're being really generous today. And we'll cancel that. What you'll see is that order now goes to 2. What does this mean? It means that you can quickly look at the list and have a quick idea how many times have I processed this order in the past. That's really meaningful because if you sort your list that way, you'll have an idea of, you know, who have I been kind of running around for stock on this one? Is this a point where I can no longer fill this item and maybe I should take some other action, you know, source this from somewhere else? So there's lots of different sort of options that are available here. Running a bit tight on time, but there's a couple of key topics I want to get to, and let's get to the most important one, I think. I want to integrate sales and purchases. So I've talked about a bunch of different changes or things that you didn't have in Business Vision that you do have in Spire. I think this is probably one of the most important. I think I have 5 or 6 the most important at this point, but this one is an important one. The case is I have specific purchases created for customer orders, and I need to manage my requirements better. Al does some great presentations, and I think there's some good YouTube videos on requisitions, and in his example, often the requisitions will be based off of inventory. So I go in and I'm requisitioning based on reorder points and so on. And that's all a perfectly great example of how you might process requisitions. But another way, and it's a fairly common way and with a lot of the customers I've worked with, is to process requisitions from the standpoint of filling specific customers' requirements. So again, what does that mean? Let's start, just to keep this nice and clean, let's do just from the beginning. We'll add a new inventory item. This is a BB-999, and this is a bench press high weight. Another one. Sells for 1,000, costs 500 by default, and we're going to establish a primary vendor. This is who I normally buy it from. Let's go ahead, BB-999, we'll save and close that, and we'll add it to all warehouses. I'm going to go into sales, and this is fairly common. I've created that item because I have the intention of selling it to somebody, and then I'm going to turn around and try and order it. So for customer A309, I'm going to create an order for them for a BB-9999, and that's fine. They want, let's make it 2 of them, just to illustrate the example. So at this point, oftentimes what happens, and certainly for the clients I've worked with in Business Vision, is you go out and you create the purchase order for that vendor. And the problem is that when you create purchase orders that way, it's pretty easy to lose track of the association between the sales order and the purchase order, especially when you're kind of vying over inventory. So let's, at this point, save that sales order, but I also want to process something called a requisition. So I'll go ahead and requisition it. At this point, you'll notice the on order column here is blank. That's because I haven't processed this requisition yet. If you keep an eye on that, when I click process, what happens is it automatically does one of two things. It either creates a new purchase order if there isn't an open purchase order for the vendor, or it amends an existing purchase order if a purchase order is out there and it hasn't been issued. The idea being, more things on single purchase orders is better. Easier shipping, you tend to get better discounts that way, and so on. So it's went ahead and created 7005.3. So I'll save that, close this, and I'll save and close. So we'll go look at purchases. I think we said it was 7005.3. And a couple of things are worth noting here. It's added that item that I ordered to the end of that purchase order. So there's my BR-9999. But perhaps more importantly, it's also tracking the order number it was sourced from and the customer number who ordered it. So the nice thing on the purchasing side is that I issue this purchase order, out it goes, in comes a skid, and on that skid I can now start pulling the things off the skid, but specifically putting them aside for the sales orders from which they were sourced. So if you're doing a lot of custom buying for specific customers, or they're buying out of a catalog list where you've never stocked that item before, this is super useful, because now the purchasing person knows exactly why this item was purchased and who it's supposed to go to. And then, of course, it wouldn't make much sense if purchasing handled this if the other side didn't. So if I go load 800-125, let's go do that. Sales and 800-125. What I'll see here is that if I expand the sales order out so I can see everything as well, I'll see over here that the same thing's recorded. So there's the purchase order that was created and the target type was purchase order. So you have service on both sides here now. The salesperson or the purchasing person knows exactly how this process works. But on the sales side, when the customer calls up to inquire about where their bench press is, it's already on a purchase order, and you can inquire with the purchase order, what status it's in. Has it been issued? How long has it been since it's been issued? And ask the person who's dealing with purchasing, what the ETA on that particular item is. So requisitions is great for a lot of things, but one of the things it's great for is kind of tying those two things together to manage your inventory quantities right from sales through to purchasing. And again, as far as I know of Business Vision, there's really no equivalent there. It's kind of a manual process of managing these things in batch. So I'm running a little tight on time, so let me see other things I can cover here quickly. Just say a couple quick words about this. There's an add-on for Spire called the Service Manager, and that basically allows you to maintain equipment lists. We'll provide this video and the details here, but that YouTube video is a great example Al provides about how that works. If you're servicing equipment and it's a significant part of your business, it's well worth looking at that. It can save you a lot of time, and it keeps really good history of activities that have happened with equipment. Similarly, if you manage product manufacturing and kitting isn't sufficient, meaning that there's some time dependency and labor involved in building things, there's a production order module which is available as an add-on to Spire from us that basically handles that in a very transactional way. The big advantage to that module is that it will handle inventory commitment as part of that process. So if you're struggling right now using bill of materials in Business Vision because inventory commitment is messy, that module is essentially a solution to that. It's a whole lot more, actually. You can do a whole lot more in terms of staging builds and having multi-level builds and so on, but it solves a big problem if you're struggling with bill of materials on the Business Vision side. I could do an entire presentation on that module. I talked a little bit more about it in the previous presentation as well. One of my favorite topics, which I probably can't get into in too much detail, is UPC code scanning. Suffice it to say that all throughout Spire, you can process UPC codes in a way that I think is significantly better than it is in Business Vision. What does that mean? Essentially, it means that any inventory item can have one or more UPC codes. The one-to-many thing is actually kind of a big deal. That means that when you're going into UPC codes, an item can have multiple UPC codes pointed at it. If you've ever done anything like books, you'll realize that one UPC code for a given item is not enough, because often UPCs change when you're selling version 1, version 2, and version 3, whereas to you, they're not different part numbers. To the manufacturer, they are. So that's an important point. When you have these UPC codes set up, they're super useful everywhere. You can search based on them. Let's add another UPC code here. And then they're really easy to work with from that point forward. Let's do a quick example. Let's go into sales. And now that I've got that UPC code set up, all I have to do is scan from that point forward. And if I bring up the scan, Control Spacebar brings up the scan option. If I just scan that in, it adds it into the list, and it will accumulate in the list as well. So that if it's got multiple items, I can just keep scanning and scanning and scanning. Very straightforward and easy to use. You can also fill based on UPC codes, which is really useful. I think I won't go into the full topic here, but suffice it to say that something that Spire has that Business Vision doesn't is both on the sales side and on the purchase side, you have the option to fill based on these UPC codes. So I can save the sales order, have someone go pick it, and then on a bench fill based on those items that I've picked and put in a box. So rather than sort of little bits and pieces like point of sale that handle UPC code scanning, Spire really has a nice slick system that runs throughout the software, both for using UPC codes for scanning, for creating sales orders, receiving purchase orders, packing sales orders, and so on. Stock count is really well done in Spire if you're using a barcode reader. I'd say it's so useful that even in companies where you're not necessarily dealing with barcodes, wholesale retail type environments, it's almost worth just having a page full of barcoded most common items as a quick way for you to be able to work with them. Barcode readers these days are so cheap that it's really worth it. I had a more elaborate example, but since I'm sort of pressing my luck on time, I think I'll probably stop it there. Let's come back. I was going to show you an example, but I kind of got into this in a little bit about database access, but I think I'll push that off to the next presentation. Really easy to work with database that frankly is far superior to Pervasive, which is the Business Vision database. And I don't ever like ending presentations without mentioning the whole notion of the API. You hear everybody talking about Spire, talking about API. The short version of this is an API is what allows people like third-party developers to quickly be able to integrate, to do things like create purchase orders and sales orders and so on. If you're looking for a developer, mention the word REST, and generally speaking, anybody who's done any web development will know exactly what that is and shouldn't have a hard time getting off to a start. And we have some good starting documents that I recently was involved in creating that should get people off to a faster start. So that was literally using my very last second in terms of the presentation, but where do you go from here? If you're interested in this, or you want to see a Spire demo, or you want a little bit more elaboration, talk to your partner. They can give you a lot of information. When in doubt, if you don't have a partner or you're not sure where to go, you're certainly welcome to contact us. We can hook you up with a partner or provide additional information. As I mentioned, I'm very interested in feedback. So if you think something wasn't covered that you want to see, let me know, because the plan is to continue to do these presentations essentially for anybody who's interested. And I was asked to mention that we're extending the promotion so that if you're a Business Vision customer thinking about moving, that you have a nice discount waiting for you, but you have to make a decision about whether or not you're going to go to Spire. I think we're saying till the end of July. So it's worth making that decision at this point if you're interested. That's it. I've kind of probably blown through a lot of this very quickly. Let me just take a quick look at questions. If there's any here that are ones I can answer, bear with me a second. Actually, that's a good one. Will there be a function to search vendor part numbers? That's a good point, actually. I don't know if right now the vendor part number is part of the index, but it could very well be. So I'll actually take a look at that one. It's not terribly hard for us to add other things into what I keep referring to as a full text index. So we could very well do that. Let's go up to the top here. Two parts of that question, so that kind of is a good one, searching vendor part numbers. Please make this great presentation available online to partners. Thank you, and certainly. Our account location is not working. Where's that? Sorry, I'm having a hard time reading some of these questions. Our account location is not working. We had it working well on BV Essentials. Give our support department a call if you've got an example of that, and they can work it through with you. There were a couple of changes to the way that locations, sorry, and I should back up and refer to this as GL locations, which is a way of essentially tying segmentation to how processing transactions get processed in the general ledger. It's kind of a specific case of segmentation. We've made a couple of changes recently, but I'd really need to see the case specifically that you're referring to. The changes that we made recently were just more about what overrides what. And the general rule with location processing is the more specific the location, the more it overrides less specific. But that's a pretty vague answer. I'd really contact support about that one and just lay out your case. This is how it's set up. This is what I'm expecting. And we'll certainly have a look at that. Is there any thought of adding customer code combined? So instead of just creating a new customer code, we can merge into another. It's a fairly common question, the notion of the answer to what if I do really have two customer codes that have their own separate receivables and their own separate sales history, sort of, can I merge these into one? It's been talked about in the past. It's quite a complex scenario, because when you're saying, I just want to change this code, it's really just a question of changing a string of text. When you're saying I want to merge these things together, it's significantly more complicated, but it comes up enough that I'll check our list of product enhancement requests and see if it's on there, and if it's not, I'll make sure it is, because it's just one of those things that's hard to avoid as you build up large customer lists. Is BV reaching end of life? As we've heard from many sources, BV has told us they have no plans to do so. Politics. I suck at politics. The truth of the matter is, I don't think that it's likely that Business Vision is going to hit an end of life scenario, if I'm honest. The easy answer here would be to say, sure, you better get moving. Spire is the place you want to be. But the truth is that essentially Business Vision's in that sort of holding pattern of, we're not adding functionality, but we have no intention of removing the product from circulation. And I think that's probably a fair statement. I have some sort of behind the scenes knowledge about how Business Vision was looked at within the Sage Group. I'd say it's unlikely that it's going to disappear, but it's equally unlikely that you're going to see a lot of new functionality coming its way. And I don't really have to work hard to prove that. Just look back the last 5 or 10 years at exactly what happened. I'd say we probably add more functionality to Spire in 3 months than Business Vision has in the last 10 years. So you kind of draw your own conclusions from that one. But the end of life scare thing, I don't think that's probably fair to say that. Is there a thought of, oh, actually, I read that one already. Is there a way to record holdbacks on sales invoices and separate them on reports? We're a construction company and holdbacks affect receivables when reporting to banks. Not sure that I'm super familiar with how that's best handled in Spire. I think there might be a YouTube video on that one. If you actually want to see the list of YouTube videos that are there, just go in and type Spire accounts receivable, for example. That's probably a good place to start. I'm not sure if holdbacks are generally just handled in the accounts receivable module, or if there's something that's being done with deposits on sales orders or something along those lines. Yeah, and I'm not answering that question well, so by all means, field an email to support, and they probably have a cut sheet on how to handle holdbacks. Wish Al was here for this one because I'm sure he'd have a better answer than I do. I missed the last webinar. Is it online? Yes, it is. How about end of useful life of Business Vision? I'm not answering that one. I missed the first 20 minutes. Will this webinar be on email? Yes, it will. I may record the full version just because I could probably have used the full 2 hours. And I know I'm already pushing past the end of that. So for those not on plan, so on Business Vision plan, on an old version of Business Vision, end of life is December 2020. Well, that's fair to say. That I agree with. So if you're not on plan, you're going to need to get back on plan. And that's a fair point. I'm kind of circumspect about this one. I mean, I liked Business Vision. I spent a lot of my working life working on it, and I think it's a great product. But I really think that Spire has sort of took the bull by the horns and ran with what Business Vision I would have liked to have seen become. And to be blunt, that's part of the reason I'm here. So yeah, I think it's a good time to start thinking about other options. And I think Spire is really one of your best ones, if not your first one. So BV has issues regarding multiple receipts for one PO. Can I quickly view all invoices and attach to a PO within a PO module? We've been talking about this. At this point, we've made some improvements already to purchase order processing to make it quicker. I think you saw in one example, I was able to go quickly directly to receipts, but I do think that's a good point. I think the notion that you might have multiple POs coming in that all sort of point to one vendor invoice or vice versa, and handling that better is something that I think we need to look at. I've worked with some pretty expensive systems that kind of handle that a bit differently. So we certainly have some ideas on how that's done. So I think that's a good idea. The idea being having a completely distinct receipt module, if you like, where you go into a receiving mode and then you start pointing receipts at purchase orders or multiple purchase orders at a single kind of receipt process has been brought up. I think that's a good point. Bank recs, do they work the same? Very similar. There's a little bit more facility, I think, on Spire in terms of being able to link to a downloaded bank rec file, but the processes are, other than that, pretty much the same. Opening, closing balances, flagging transactions, being able to post journal entries directly from within the account at reconciliation, they function in a very similar fashion. I think I've blown through most of the questions. If I've missed any, I apologize. I'm having a hard time kind of looking at some of these questions in this tiny little window that is afforded me, but hopefully I've hit them all. As I say at the end of this, you should receive an email which has links, and you should also receive additional information about the previous presentation and when we post this one as well. But I'm really interested in feedback, as are we all at Spire. So if you like the presentation, that's great. But I'm as interested in what you didn't like as what you did, and whatever else you might want to see in future presentations. Personally, I'd love to see some more focused presentations on specific modules. For me, I think that would be a great idea. Let's spend an hour and a half on production, or let's spend an hour and a half on GL segmentation and location usage and profit centers and so on. Some of these topics are just frankly too big to do anything other than just give you a bit of an overview on. So that's it for, I think, the questions. If I've missed one, as I say, I apologize, but I will certainly add any kind of comments that you have at the end to future presentations. I think I've probably worn out my welcome here. Thank you very much for attending. It's a nice sunny day in Toronto, so I hope you get a chance to get out there and enjoy.